Madame Jin Lan, Executive Director of the International Mayors Communication Center, my good friend Mr. Dwayne Kissick, Mr. Nicholas Yu, and my friend of long standing, almost 40 years, Dr. Yuba Sokona. It is a great pleasure for me to be with you, even though I'm not physically present. Unfortunately, I've come down with an illness which frankly is the worst illness that I've had in my lifetime, and as a result I won't be able to join you on this and possibly on a few other occasions as well. But I do want to emphasize that I have a major commitment to the actions, the initiatives, and all the plans that you have for this remarkable institution. I believe Shenzhen can be a beacon light for the rest of humanity, and I'm particularly delighted that Madame Jin Lan, the dynamic person responsible for the activities of this organization, is at the helm of affairs. Now let me start by saying that climate change is a collective action problem. In some sense, it's like what was called the tragedy of the commons. And in the case of the tragedy of the commons, every single individual tries to exploit whatever is available by way of services, by way of resources, by way of what nature provides us. And what happens is that as long as the exploiters and the resources are in balance, then possibly we have a system by which we can ensure sustainability. But given the fact that we have a large population on this planet which has grown very rapidly, we are now exploiting a huge amount of the services that are provided by what we call the tragedy of the commons. The result of the huge expanse of what we are exploiting is the fact that there is a degradation, there is an enormous amount of damage that is done to the natural resources of this planet. And that's precisely what we have in the case of climate change. Climate change is not something that's going to be initiated by every single individual only to serve his or her own interest. Climate change, as I said, is a collective action problem. However, I do want to mention that Mahatma Gandhi very rightly said, be the change you want to see in the world. I think if we can create a consciousness all around the world by which every individual makes sure that whatever we exploit in respect and in relation to nature is going to be such that we maintain a level of sustainability. If we were to do that, then clearly the rules that we apply to what might be the collective action problem will turn out to be absolutely right. And therefore, I think when it comes to mitigation, it is crucially important that we pay attention to the single very valuable principle. It is sad that there are presidents and leaders of countries who feel that climate change is a hoax. And this, I think, is clearly, in some sense, another form of a tragedy of the commons. There are countries which have the largest number of scientific expertise, and if the chief executive, the head of the government of that organization feels that climate change is a hoax, then I'm sorry, we really have to bring about a major repair of the situation. Now, I also want to mention that we would need a substantial amount of innovation a great deal of technological change, because what's really happened is that we are now in a situation where we are consuming far more than we are able to get in terms of the capacity of nature to provide us. I might mention that the WWF brings out every 2 years a Living Planet report, and they have been saying consistently for the last 40 years the Earth has been far above the biocapacity of what we are able to provide. So therefore I think it's very important for us that while we ensure that lifestyle and behavioral changes contribute to mitigation, and here I want to highlight the fact that even dietary changes are extremely important. I recall coming to China for the first time in 1981, and there was very little meat consumption. But today, China is a huge consumer of meat, and I want to emphasize that meat is something, as far as the global cycle is concerned, has major emissions of greenhouse gases. I don't want to get into details, but if you look at what has happened in Brazil, quite apart from the fact that we have large areas of rainforests being converted to pasture land, this in turn has implications as a result of meat production that we really cannot ignore. I also want to emphasize the fact that yes, mitigation is vitally important, but we are really not providing enough for adaptation. And I think at the level of local governments, we are being subjected to heat waves, to extreme precipitation events, to sea level rise related events, and a whole host of factors, which if I may say, in the last 5 or 6 years, have come into the consciousness of human beings across the globe. And therefore, this must jar us, this must motivate us into action by which we can really bring about change. I want to also mention the fact that it was in 2011 that the IPCC, which I had the privilege of chairing from 2002 to 2015, for 13 years, we brought out a special report on extreme events and disasters. And in doing that, I talked to my colleagues and I told them that this report will be a game changer. And indeed it was. I think another game changer has been the recent report, which I'm sure Dr. Yuba Sukona would be able to tell you about in much greater detail. It's the 1.5 degree Celsius report, which I think should also jar us into action and motivate us to take action. Now, I would like to mention that it is particularly important that adaptation measures are also receiving the kind of support that is commensurate with the extent to which adaptation is required, and the extent to which the impacts of climate change are actually taking place. Now, there has been some minor increase in development assistance from the developed to the developing world. But the fact is that much of the development assistance is, if I may say, also being packaged into climate change action. And if we go back in time, there's an established norm that development assistance should be of the order of 0.7% of the GDP of every developed country. We are nowhere near that norm. There are some countries which are very good and are pretty close and sometimes even above that norm, but there are many others that are pathetically weak in that regard. Now, as a result, I think while we see that over 25 years the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change came into existence, emissions in 2018 are still going up. Now that to my mind is really a proclamation of failure. It's to my mind a disaster, because as long as these emissions keep going up, we are going to get very severe impacts of climate change, and therefore very heavy risks that are going to be associated with it. And I think this is where, again, I go back to the issue of a collective action problem. I had the privilege of receiving the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the IPCC in 2007, and I used the Sanskrit term called Vasudeva Tamuka. We are now becoming so increasingly interconnected with every other aspect. We are now becoming so intimately connected with every part of the globe that unless we are able to live up to this standard of what I said is Vasudeva Kutumbakam, which means the universe is one family, we will certainly be able to destroy this earth in a very short period of time. So what I would like to submit is that if you look at the Paris Agreement, then clearly the NDCs, to my mind, are pathetically weak. Now what we really need to do is to raise the level of ambition on the part of societies which are represented by these governments. And if they're able to do that, then perhaps there is hope. This is where, in my view, youth are going to be absolutely crucial. And that's what I would like to focus on, particularly in respect of the fact that there are 1.8 billion youth in this world between the ages of 10 and 24, and their future is at stake. So if they have to accept the science of climate change, emissions need to peak by 2020. Extreme events, they understand, will become far more threatening, far more menacing. And the world has to set this goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius, because let us say those who advocate some kind of an overshoot scenario, that means you go above 1.5 and then technology and other factors will bring you down. That, to my mind, is going to be disastrous. We therefore need to make sure that emissions peak by 2020, and in any case emissions become carbon neutral by 2040. So an overshoot scenario is clearly not acceptable, and the only hope in my mind lies in the hands of the youth. Let me turn to the next picture that's available on projection of key variables. If you look at population, if you look at emissions, then the next picture clearly shows you how we are going to bring about a major reduction in the emissions of greenhouse gases, and certainly the percentage GDP per capita will also need to be reflecting this reality as quickly as possible. If we go to the next picture, then what we have is a projection of key variables. This is energy intensity of GDP and carbon intensity of energy. So what we need to do is to bring about a reduction in energy intensity and perhaps an even sharper reduction in carbon intensity. And this is where I would say that Shenzhen would be a remarkable location by which not only is China going to be a major factor in dealing with climate change, but also to make sure that China becomes a leader in the rest of the world. Now, I wanted to mention right at the end what I have launched in 2016 as something called the POP movement, which stands for Protect Our Planet. And this is an action which is driven by youth all over the world. We also have a modest presence in China, and I hope we're going to build on that very rapidly. But it's the youth of the world whose minds, if I may say so, are not polluted, who realize that they have a stake in the future and they're going to bring about major changes through grassroots actions. They would do that in institutions, universities, colleges, everywhere, but they will also make sure that this acts as a form of advocacy for the adults all over the world. I want to turn finally to what Confucius said. Youth has to be regarded with respect. How do we know that his future will not be equal to our present? Well, we know for a fact that his future will not be equal to our present, particularly if we continue with the manner in which we are bringing about a major increase in the emissions of greenhouse gases, a major increase in the damage and destruction of ecosystems over the planet. And therefore, it's the youth of the world who have to seize this moment in their hands. And I hope Shenzhen would be a major location by which we can bring this about. I want to apologize that I have probably given you something which is not as effective as I would have liked it to be, but I have been fairly sick, and I perhaps got carried away with some issues which are very important, and I hope they will be seen as such, and I'm sure the discussions that take place would be very enlightening, and thank you very much for this opportunity.